Though I typically prefer the familiarity of more traditional architectures, occasionally a synth will come along that tempts me to step outside of my comfort zone. Something that sounds truly interesting or unique and in a musical way. I'd been intrigued by today's synth for a while, thinking about trying to get my hands on it, but for a variety of reasons hadn't yet taken the plunge. But when the manufacturer coincidentally reached out to see if I'd be interested in trying it out, it seemed like a sign, and I excitedly asked them to send it over. While I was vaguely familiar with the concept of vector synthesis, this was the first time I actually got to try it out. I was admittedly skeptical that it might be a gimmick, but what I found was a world of tones and textures that I simply haven't heard from other synths before. I'm Donald Jordan for Bloom Music, and this is Vector. Vector synthesis has its roots back to the Prophet VS, a classic synth of the 80s that blended 4 different oscillators together using a kind of coordinate plane that you could navigate using either modulation or its signature joystick. While revolutionary at the time, the VS's vector synthesis was fairly simple, with static sounds to blend between. Later implementations of vector synthesis introduced progressively more complex sound sources to blend, but the Vector takes this to a new level. To begin to understand what makes this synthesis style so unique, let's take a look at the Vector Synth's architecture. The Vector is capable of 4 simultaneous, unique tones, each of which is designated a corner of a matrix. An interactive node called an orbiter dances around this matrix based on paths that you can manipulate in various ways, and its position at any given time determines the audio mix of the unique tones living in each of the 4 corners. Where the Vector improves heavily upon its forebears is that each of the 4 tones is essentially a full synth voice, each with its own filter and 2 generators, which can be freely blended or cross-modulated. The generators can produce 6 different waveforms plus noise, and by way of blending and modulating offer a basically infinite palette of timbral content. Each filter is multi-mode with high pass, band pass, low pass, and formant filters available. Modulation is handled by 2 ADSR envelopes, and then the various manipulations of the orbiter's position on the matrix. All of that is then passed through a suite of voicing options and effects. To better understand how all this adds up to some truly unique synthesis potential, let's first take a deeper look at the synth's individual components. When I first pulled the Vector out of the box and saw the controls and labeling, I was initially concerned that this was going to be a macro-oriented interface where any deep editing would be relegated to the touchscreen. There are few UI sins greater than leaning on a touchscreen for editing, especially when you have a face full of knobs. I might as well pull out an iPad with a $3 app at that point. But those fears were quickly put to rest, as the Vector's controls are laid out in a way that intuitively supports its unique synthesis style, and pretty much all patch editing duties are accomplished using the hardware knobs, buttons, and switches. That's not to say the touchscreen isn't put to good use, but for sure, knobs are better for some tasks, and touchscreens are better suited for others, and it's clear that the team behind the Vector understands this. Want to edit your oscillator and filter parameters, either one corner at a time or even all at once? 100% hardware controls. Want to make complex adjustments to the filter routing matrix? It's a breeze with the touchscreen. Need to see and adjust all of your effects parameters? All hardware control, with the layout intuitively matching the on-screen feedback. Want to fine-tune your decay node's position on the orbiter matrix while notes play back to hear the results in real time? The touchscreen instinctively handles this. Whatever you're editing, it seems like you are always using the most intuitive method of input. It's the perfect marriage of hardware controls and a touchscreen. The corners of the orbiter matrix represent the 4 available tones, and each corner houses 2 generators and a filter. The generators are the sound source of the Vector, and each generator has a bank of 7 wave types that you can scroll through. While 7 wave types might not sound like much, all the complexity of the sound comes when you blend or modulate these generators together. The blend knob pulls double duty, controlling whether you are blending or modulating the generators, depending on which way you turn it. When turning counterclockwise from center, you are blending from 100% generator 1 to an even mix of generator 1 and 2. And as you turn clockwise from center, you are increasing the modulation depth of the generators. It's a clever implementation where a single knob gives you an extremely wide range of timbres. The sounds you can get span the spectrum from analog style to aggressively digital, and you can get some especially gnarly tones by modulating with the noise. Entering the blend mode view, you can select the type of modulation between the generators. There are various options and combinations of phase and amplitude modulation available, and while the manual goes into great detail for those interested, a deep knowledge of these different modulation methods isn't required to whip up interesting sounds. Switch between them while tweaking the generator modulation, and you'll quickly get a feel for the type of sounds available. Probably the most significant distinction between the modulation types is that AM is a cross modulation, whereas PM is a direct modulation where generator 1 is the carrier and generator 2 is the modulator. The tuning of the generators is handled via the tune view, and you have 5 tuning options per generator, all of which are ratios of the root. These ratios will help keep things tidy and musical, especially when you get into aggressive modulations. While I understand the functionality of the ratios, I still wish there was a way to fine-tune the generators. You do have the ability to detune voices, which we'll see when we get to the voicing section, but there is no way to fine-tune the individual generators within a single voice to get that classic detuned beating of the oscillator frequencies. Once you've found a generator blend that you like, you can sculpt the sound of your corner with a filter. With the exception of the formant filter, which is doing its vowel thing, these filters are mostly utilitarian, with no major character to speak of. They do a perfect job of cutting or isolating the required frequencies, but don't expect more than that. In contrast to typical synths, which derive much of their character from the tone, behavior, and modulation of their filters, the Vector's filters exist just to, well, filter. There is resonance, but it is pretty subdued, and again, not a lot of character. You shouldn't expect typical synth filter behavior from the Vector. In fact, you won't even be modulating the filter cutoff at all. All of the Vector's movement, dynamics, and personality comes from the orbiter. The orbiter matrix is the heart and soul of the Vector and is definitely what makes the synth special. As we've established, each corner has a set of 2 generators and a filter, and there are 4 corners on the orbiter matrix, so effectively 4 unique timbres present. When you play a note, a small orb will begin to traverse a path on the matrix, and its position on the matrix represents the mix or blend of the 4 corners. This is all kind of difficult to articulate, but it's very simple to demonstrate. So first, I'll show you a corner at a time, 4 very distinct sounds. In corner 1, I have a saw wave. In corner 2, I have a square wave. In corner 3, I have this digital wave. And in corner 4, I have noise. I'll now back out of the focus mode to reactivate all 4 corners, and when I play a note, you can see this little orb following the path, and as it moves to each corner, we can hear how the audio is dynamically blending to the tone housed in that corner. So again, a saw in corner 1, a square in corner 2, a digital wave in 3, and noise in corner 4. When you introduce different, more elaborate paths, the blending becomes more dynamic and organic, a constant drift between timbres. There's also a warp feature that lets you modify the path in interesting ways, and then you can also resize and move it however you want by interacting with it directly on the touchscreen. Now I set up 4 very boring but distinct corners to make it easy to hear how the matrix works, and this is how something like the Prophet VS worked, just blending between 4 static waveforms. But the magic starts to happen when you start blending more complex timbres. This can be as subtle or dramatic as you prefer, depending on the variation between your 4 corners. And then you can introduce variation and phasing between the voices by switching from a single master orbiter to a unique offset orbiter per voice. Personally, I prefer subtle variations between the corners. While the ability to morph between 4 dramatically different sounds is powerful and unique, once the novelty wore off, I often didn't find it very musical. As someone who prefers less theatrics in the movement and dynamics of a patch, I find it much more interesting to morph between 4 corners that are only subtly different. You can get some sweet, organic, constantly moving but completely coherent patches this way. In addition to the various shapes and Lissajous paths available, there is also an ADSR mode for the orbiter matrix. As someone who likes to be very deliberate in their patch design, this allowed me to have complete control of the corner blending of my patch over time. The ADSR path is shown on the matrix, and you can drag the nodes of each envelope stage wherever you want. So if I want my attack to go from corner 4 to 1, and then my decay down to corner 3, and then my release to corner 2, just a few swipes on the touchscreen and I'm golden. You can also move these points as you play notes to fine-tune the location and find that perfect blend without any glitches or artifacts. In addition to the path that your little node rides on, you can also introduce an orbit. It's super simple with just two controls, one to control the size of the orbit, and one to control the speed. An easy way to hear how this works is to go back to our basic saw, square, digital wave, noise corners, and start orbiting from the very center. So before introducing any orbit with my sustain node right in the middle of the matrix, I'm getting an even blend of my four corners. Now, as I introduce some orbit, you can hear how I'm starting to get a smooth blend between the corners. And as I increase the orbit size, I'm getting closer to the extremes of the matrix, so that corner blending becomes more and more obvious. And then I can also adjust the speed of the orbit. This is a powerful modulation tool, and when combined with the matrix path, makes for some brilliantly organic movement. It's also just fun to watch all these little green orbs dance all over the screen. As I said, I prefer subtle variations between my corners, so my workflow often consists of finding a starting sound I like while modifying all four corners at once, and then from there going corner to corner making slight changes that I think will sound interesting when blending between. There were several times where I made a really interesting sound on a single corner and then wanted the ability to quickly copy it to another corner, but this functionality unfortunately doesn't exist. I reached out to the Vector team to ask about this, and they confirmed it is not a current feature, but they have seen several requests for it and are looking into potentially adding it in a future firmware update. It was super encouraging to hear that the team is still actively gathering user feedback and working hard to improve the synth, even years after its release. We saw this most recently with the latest update that added MPE support to the Vector. Other synth manufacturers, take note. This is how it's done. Accessing the effects screen reveals all of the Vector's voicing, arpeggiator, and effects controls. There are 3 voice modes available: mono, poly, and dual. Mono, of course, takes you down to a single voice, but also allows you to stack up to 16 voices and then adjust the detune between the voices for nice unison sounds. You can also control the relative volume of the stacked voices for a more restrained effect. Poly mode mostly behaves as you'd expect, giving you full access to all 16 voices, but you can add some additional complexity using the stereo knob to distribute the voices across the stereo field, and the detune knob to introduce analog-style drift between the voices. The surprise voice mode for me was dual, which cuts the polyphony down to 8, but each note plays 2 voices which can then be detuned and spread across the stereo field. It's excellent for making thick, immersive patches, and it's one of those things it's hard not to leave on all the time once you discover it. I don't typically bother to mention rudimentary things like arpeggiators, because they're usually pretty straightforward, but I thought the Vectors deserved a special call-out. It does everything you'd expect, but adds a cool per-step octave control. You can easily tap in an octave setting per step, and this can quickly turn a typical arpeggio into something much more exciting. Finally, on the effects screen, we have the, you guessed it, effects. There is a reverb, delay, chorus, and drive available. All the effects behave pretty much as you'd expect, and are high quality, even if a bit vanilla. Each has its own bandpass filter to help sculpt the tone of the effects, which is a very nice touch. It's easy to dial in a darker delay or a focused chorus. There is also an always available tremolo and vibrato on the left side of the panel. These are not actually tied to the effects screen and can be accessed at any time. This might initially seem like an odd choice, but having instant access to these at any time without having to worry about any modulation routings is a godsend. I'm only ever a couple seconds away from wavering, warbly goodness. The biggest problem is just remembering not to overuse it. So that does it for the individual components of the Vector. Now let's hear some patch examples before I wrap up. The official website calls Vector an experimental exploratory synthesizer, and this is absolutely accurate. It's not just marketing jargon. I found it to be an exercise in wandering journeys and happy accidents, which can initially be a struggle if you're someone who prefers to be 100% deliberate in your patch creation, or you are more comfortable working within a classic subtractive paradigm. There were several times I instinctively looked for the LFO controls, only to remember, oh yeah, it doesn't have those. This synth has no interest in entertaining quote-unquote normal expectations. The Vector compels you to leave typical synthesis conventions behind. It forces you to rethink how you go about modulation and movement. But if you do, you'll find an intricate playground capable of amazing new sounds. I often tout the OG Junos as the ultimate jam synths, the definitive example of synth immediacy, something that can go from init patch to jamming in the pocket in seconds. The Vector is essentially the anti-Juno. It's on the other side of the spectrum, a true programmer's synth. You can noodle endlessly on this thing, fiddling with the minutia of a patch indefinitely. For those who crave complex, evolving sounds, it's a dream. It's also a bit of a chameleon. Yes, it's proudly digital and you can get those DX7-style glacier bell-like textures, but because the Vector also houses traditional waveforms and filters, you can get into familiar subtractive territory. The beauty of the Vector often lies somewhere between those two extremes, blending and dancing between them fluidly. It's an agnostic synth, categorically indefinable, unconcerned with coasts or conventional architectures. All of that is just a long-winded way to say, you will get sounds out of this synth that are truly unique.